Hello and welcome back to Sceptic Takeout. In this episode, we're going to be beginning a series looking at those religious figures that believers call the best of men. And in the first installment, we're starting big with a man who many don't just consider the best example of humanity, but also believe to be God himself, Jesus. Don't forget, you can follow us on Facebook by hitting the link in the description where you will find information regarding this and upcoming episodes. And be sure not to miss an episode by hitting those like and subscribe buttons. So what is it that we mean by the best of men? Well, simply put, we're talking about those figures that are exalted above all others. We're going to begin the series with Jesus, and in future episodes we're going to ask the same questions about Muhammad and Siddhartha, the Buddha. The important thing to establish here is what questions exactly we are going to be asking. How exactly are we going to judge these figures who've had so much influence on people's lives? Well, for this mini-series we're going to assume the historicity of all three. This isn't going to be a historical analysis of whether Jesus existed or not. That question is hotly debated on its own, even amongst the experts. And though it will be a topic of future episodes of Sceptic Takeout, we're not concerning ourselves with it here. What we are going to be looking at here are the aspects of what attracts believers to dedicating their lives to the teachings of these men. What are the things that make people accept these men as the pinnacle of humanity? This will be contrasted by looking at the criticisms levelled at them, both in their own lifetimes and now, and asking of both sides of the coin, does this correspond to what we accept as exalted behaviours? In short, are the believers justified in holding these standards against the behaviours and characters of the figures themselves? So, who is Jesus? While we're not going to question whether Jesus existed or not, an even more difficult question is deciding which Jesus it is we're going to analyse. Is it Jesus, the first century fire and brimstone Jewish preacher who believed that the end was going to come in his own lifetime? Is it Jesus, the cult leader, breakaway rebel who had his own esoteric ideas about the inner God and used secret, cryptic teachings for the ears of those initiated into his group? Is it Jesus of mainstream Christianity, at once man and God, who gave himself for the ultimate sacrifice for the love of all his children? Or is it one of the many other figures argued over as the authentic Jesus of history? Well, for the sake of today's programme, we're going to use Jesus, who is both man and God, on the basis that it is this version of Jesus, more than any other, who is the beneficiary of the highest praise amongst his followers, and who most resembles the figure of the best of men who we are asking after. This, of course, presents us with the difficulty from the outset. Is it Jesus the man or God himself who we are judging here? To me, it seems only fair that if we're looking at Jesus the God-man, then we also have to take a look at God himself as portrayed in the Bible. And it is well known that God could be both vengeful and full of wrath, as well as loving and kind. So we're going to look at both sides of this character. So what is it that the followers of Jesus consider to be these qualities that elevate him above all others? Well, first of all, he called for his followers to care for the poor. And not just his followers, also those who were wealthy, he called to care for the poor as a priority. His love for his friends, his instructions not to judge people, reaching out to those on the margins of society, healing the sick, and Christians point to his own struggles as an extreme humbleness for one of his divine nature. In fact, Jesus is often held as the pinnacle of behaviour. What would Jesus do is often heard in Christian circles. If we get angry, we are told we should turn the other cheek, as Jesus taught. Jesus is held in such high regard that people throughout history have publicly spoken about his influence. Martin Luther King Jr., Charles Dickens, Vincent van Gogh, and of course C.S. Lewis have all praised Jesus as moral standard. But the praise doesn't end with Christians. Mahatma Gandhi, the Dalai Lama, and Vietnamese Sen teacher and activist Thich Nhat Hanh have all spoken highly of him, with the latter two having both written about Jesus and the Gospels in The Good Heart and Living Buddha, Living Christ, respectively. Perhaps to a Christian audience, one of the most surprising and influential advocates of Jesus in history was Muhammad, the founder of Islam. Although in Islam Jesus is not divine, he is considered a prophet of God and is known by the Arabic term Isa in Maryam, translated literally as Jesus, son of Mary. But Jesus had plenty of criticism levelled against him too. In his own time, the Pharisees were critical of Jesus and his followers for not following Mosaic law. This wasn't a problem for Christians, who saw Jesus as the head of a new covenant, but for the Jews of the time, this was outright blasphemy. There have been several modern philosophers who have given varying degrees of criticism to Jesus as well. Nietzsche considered some of Jesus' teachings unnatural, while Bertrand Russel said of Jesus that he was not so wise as some other people have been, and used comparisons to Socrates to demonstrate his attitude to his listeners. Saying of Jesus, one does find repeatedly a vindictive fury against those people who would not listen to his preaching. Russell clearly was not a fan. I would suggest, though, that the most well-known of Jesus' critics in philosophy, certainly regarding the conversation around Jesus' moral structure, is David Hume. For Hume, God is unnecessary for a moral society, and the foundations for morality are various elements of our own nature as human beings. So far, we've concentrated on what people thought about Jesus the man. But Christians don't consider Jesus just a man. To them, he is also divine, and I think it is only fair to say that between the Old Testament and the New Testament, God appears to have undergone a radical humour transplant. Contrasting to what we've heard about Jesus, protector of the poor, humble, healer of the sick, the God of the Old Testament is vengeful, a tester of faith, and in what has become a great issue of divide regarding morality between the apologetic and atheist communities, instigator of slavery. While this may come as a shock to many Christians, the charge of advocate for slavery is by no means a new one against the God of the Old Testament, nor has it always been those challenging Christianity making the arguments. In 1861, a pamphlet was written entitled A Scriptural, Ecclesiastical and Historical View of Slavery by John Henry Hopkins, which claimed that the Bible did not forbid slavery and that it was not a sin. Preceding this, however, and far greater in scope, were two works by the Reverend Thornton Stringfellow, who in 1850 wrote A Brief Examination of Scripture Testimony on the Institution of Slavery, followed by the 1856 book Scriptural and Statistical Views in Favour of Slavery, and in the same year as Hopkins' pamphlet Slavery, Its Origin, Nature and History. In the introduction to Scriptural and Statistical Views in Favour of Slavery, Stringfellow wrote, I propose, therefore, to examine the sacred volume briefly, and if I am not gravely mistaken, I shall be able to make it appear that the institution of slavery has received, in the first place, the sanction of the Almighty in the patriarchal age, that it was incorporated into the only national constitution which ever emanated from God, that its legality was recognised and its relative duties regulated by Jesus Christ in his kingdom, and that it is full of mercy. While Stringfellow used both the Old and New Testament in the defence of slavery, many modern-day apologists concentrate on the Old Testament in their defence of God on this position. God, they will say, was giving instruction to the societies of the time, societies that were fully accepting of slavery, and therefore to give them rule and regulation of slavery was to turn them into a far more progressive society. Well, no. First of all, God was quite happy to give them instructions stating that they could beat their slaves, as long, of course, as the slave didn't die. In Exodus we are told, anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. But more importantly, what is glaringly overlooked by these apologists is that God is, well, God. Why does God have to make a society more progressive by allowing slave owners to beat their slaves? Why not just say to them, I am God, slavery is abhorrent, disobey me and trust me, I will be kicking you in the booty faster than you can say Jesus. And it doesn't, it really doesn't, despite what the apologists will have us believe, end in the New Testament. In around 62 AD, Paul is credited with writing Ephesians. In it, he says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. And really we should ask, why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't the law of Moses still stand in the New Testament? After all, Matthew reports that Jesus tells us during the Sermon on the Mount, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly, I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law, until everything is accomplished. Clearly, heaven and earth have not disappeared. Therefore, clearly, the law of Moses should still stand. Interestingly, this is the same speech that is often pointed to as one of the highlights of Jesus' moral teaching. It is, after all, the text where Jesus tells us, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, blessed are the merciful, and so on. We have only scratched the surface of the moral objections to God's instructions here. We could ask, are women viewed as property? Check. Is slaughter on the instruction of God permissible? Check. We have verses where an entire people was slaughtered on the instructions of God, except for the virgin girls who were taken as spoils of war. Now therefore, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known a man by sleeping with him. But all the young girls who have not known a man by sleeping with him, keep alive for yourselves. We could demonstrate countless times in the Bible where God commands specifically abhorrent actions that many Christians simply aren't aware of. You see, many churches have a cyclical teaching calendar called the lectionary. The Roman Catholic, Anglican and Eastern Orthodox churches all have their own version of the lectionary, and it's a method of teaching that's becoming more popular. So what are lectionaries, and what do they mean for our conversation? Well, the simplest way to look at it is as a method of worship planning. The teachings are repeated on the same day each year or number of years. The Catholic Church uses a 3-year cycle, and the teachings usually correspond to a specific event in the church calendar. What this means, and this may come as a surprise to many non-Christians and some Christians alike, is that when you go to church, you're not going to be taught the whole of the Bible. Conveniently, all those parts about slaughtering children and taking virgin girls as spoils of war rarely, if ever, get pride of place, or even the slightest mention from the pulpit. The churches, it seems, are more than willing to guide their flock, even if that means guiding them away from the more difficult moral questions about Christian teachings. So, is Jesus the best of men? Can he be pointed to as a light in the darkness to follow in order to emulate his moral spirit? It seems that regardless of our analysis and showing that Jesus as a teacher, albeit with many commendable characteristics, combined with the Old Testament character of God, is by no means a moral champion. Still, those who follow Jesus as man and God will continue to elevate his moral character. This is demonstrated not just in the private practice of Christians, but also in popular culture, as Claire Foy, in her portrayal of Queen Elizabeth II in conversation with Paul Sparks' Billy Graham in the Netflix TV series The Crown, states, "It's the values of Christian living that root me, guide me, define me." It seems that whatever legitimate criticism we level against those questionable moral teachings, as man and as God, those who believe will continue to draw a target around the morality that they see in Jesus' moral teachings and excuse those less favourable traits. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider liking and subscribing to our channel, as well as liking the Facebook page for all the latest updates. You can find links for my friends and other useful information contained in this episode in the description below. In our next episode, we will be responding to the claims made by one creationist that science and the Bible are perfectly in line regarding the creation account. I look forward to seeing you then.